Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, an AMFT solution-focused therapist, a parenting strategist, family systems coach, and I specialize in ADHD, anxiety, and emotional regulation across the family system. I'm also a mother to a thriving, neurodivergent 23-year-old son. I've been married for over 3 decades, and I bring both professional expertise and lived experience into these conversations. Today's episode is an important one, and yes, it is meant to get your attention, not through exaggeration, but through reality. It's your wake-up call, because what happens during brain development matters, and the choices, environments, and coping tools used during this window can either support maturation or quietly derail it. If you have felt uneasy, concerned, or unsure whether something is just a phase, this episode is meant to sharpen that instinct, not dismiss it. The goal here is urgency with understanding, so parents can intervene early, intentionally, and effectively before missed opportunities for brain growth become harder to recover later. This is about understanding what is actually happening in the brain, especially an ADHD brain, when substances like nicotine, vaping, THC, or other drugs enter the picture while the brain is still developing. Because once you understand the neuroscience, the behavior makes more sense. And when the behavior makes sense, parents can respond with strategy instead of fear. And here is what I want you to hold from the very beginning. A developing brain is not just learning content in school, it is learning regulation. It is learning decision-making. It is learning how to tolerate discomfort, boredom, frustration, embarrassment, and delay. So when substances enter during development, you are not only dealing with a habit or a phase, you are often dealing with an interruption in the exact training process that builds maturity. Before we talk about substances, we have to understand the terrain. The brain is not one unit. It is a system of systems. Different parts of the brain have different jobs, and they develop at different speeds. Parents often expect the whole brain to behave like an adult brain just because their child is tall, verbal, or looks grown. But verbal skill and brain maturity are not the same thing. The brainstem runs survival. Breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, basic sleep cycles, and arousal. This is the part of the brain that keeps a child alive and functioning before they ever learn self-control. If a child is chronically stressed, sleep-deprived, or overwhelmed, the brainstem and survival circuits dominate. That means the brain shifts into a state of reactivity. You can ask for logic, but the system is not built for logic in that moment. The cerebellum is often misunderstood as just a movement and balance center, but it also plays a role in timing, rhythm, sequencing, attention regulation, and smoothing transitions. That matters in ADHD because many children with ADHD struggle with pacing and timing. They rush through work, they interrupt, they jump ahead, they misjudge time, and they underestimate steps. A lot of parents interpret this as careless. Often it is a timing and regulation system problem. The limbic system is the emotional center. This includes the amygdala, which detects threat and triggers fight, flight, or freeze, and the hippocampus, which helps store emotional memory and context. The limbic system is designed to protect you quickly. It reacts before you think. That is the point. It is a smoke alarm, not a judge. In ADHD, anxiety, and high-stress environments, the limbic system becomes more dominant. That looks like intense emotions, quick defensiveness, shutdown, or rage. Parents often think their child is being dramatic. From a brain perspective, the smoke alarm is going off. Then we have the cerebral cortex, the thinking brain. This is the part of the brain that integrates information, solves problems, and supports higher-level cognition. And at the very front of the cortex sits the most important player in today's episode. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functioning. Executive functioning is the set of skills that allow a person to manage themselves in the world. It includes planning, impulse control, emotional regulation, working memory, decision making, time management, and the ability to think about future consequences. This is the part of the brain that says, pause, think, is this worth it? What happens next if I do this? This is also the part of the brain that helps a teen say, I want to do that, but I am not going to. Or I feel embarrassed, but I can handle it. Or I am bored, but I can still finish. Here's the key fact most people don't know. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature. In neurotypical development, this process continues into the mid to late 20s, and in some individuals closer to age 30. Why does it take so long? Because this region relies on myelination and synaptic pruning. Myelination is the insulation that speeds communication between brain regions. Synaptic pruning is the brain's process of strengthening useful pathways and trimming inefficient ones. This means the brain is constantly asking, which pathways get used? Which ones get reinforced? Which ones get trimmed? Executive function is not instinctive. It is built. So when parents say, why does my teen know the rule and still break it? The answer is often this. Knowing is not the same as having a fully wired brake system under stress. Knowledge lives in one part of the brain. Implementation under emotion lives in the prefrontal cortex. That system is still developing. In ADHD, the timeline for brain development is extended, with research consistently showing that prefrontal cortical maturation is delayed by approximately 2 to 3 years. This does not reflect lower intelligence, lack of insight, or lack of effort. It simply means the CEO of the brain is still onboarding. When translated into real life, this delay often shows up as uneven development rather than global impairment. A child may be able to debate like a lawyer, yet struggle to pack a backpack. A teen may speak eloquently about long-term goals, but be unable to initiate homework. A young adult may be charming and socially skilled while still struggling to sustain routines or tolerate boredom without spiraling. This is not hypocrisy. It is a mismatch between verbal or social abilities and executive functioning capacity. The ADHD brain also struggles with dopamine inefficiency, which directly affects motivation, initiation, and sustained effort. Dopamine tends to clear too quickly, baseline levels are often lower, and signaling is inconsistent, causing motivation to be driven by interest, urgency, novelty, or immediate reward rather than importance. This is why parents often say their child can focus on video games for hours and wonder why they cannot apply that same focus elsewhere. Attention in ADHD is not about effort. It is about the brain's reward system. High reward activities supply enough dopamine to keep the prefrontal cortex engaged, while low reward tasks do not, making boring or effortful activities feel nearly impossible. In addition, communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is less efficient, meaning emotions often arrive faster than logic. A child may feel flooded, threatened, embarrassed, or overwhelmed and react before the thinking brain has time to intervene. This neurological reality becomes especially important to understand when substances enter the picture. This is one of the most important concepts parents need to understand, and it is rarely explained clearly. If an ADHD brain is already developing 2 to 3 years behind in the prefrontal cortex, and substances are introduced during that window, then yes, development can be delayed even further. Not permanently doomed, but delayed in very real, measurable ways. Here's why development requires practice, not just time. Brain development is not like a clock that advances automatically with age. The prefrontal cortex matures through repeated use. Skills such as impulse control, emotional regulation, frustration tolerance, planning, and delayed gratification only become wired when the brain actively practices them in real situations. This is a critical point for parents to understand because the experiences that build executive functioning are often the ones children and teens dislike the most. Waiting, being bored, feeling disappointed, not getting what they want, having to redo work, being corrected, and sitting with discomfort without escaping are all moments that strengthen the brain's regulatory systems. These uncomfortable experiences are not setbacks. They are the training ground where executive skills are built. Those moments are workouts for the CEO. When substances like nicotine or THC are introduced, the brain learns a different lesson. Instead of learning, I can tolerate discomfort or I can regulate this feeling, the brain learns, I can mute this or I can bypass this. When a skill is not practiced, it does not strengthen. And when a neural pathway is not used, it does not myelinate, and this is a critical concept in understanding brain development. Myelination is the process by which neural pathways are coated with myelin, a fatty insulating layer that allows signals to travel faster, more efficiently, and with less effort. The more a pathway is used, the thicker and stronger this insulation becomes, making the skill feel more automatic over time. When a pathway is rarely activated or consistently bypassed, that insulation does not form, leaving communication between brain regions slow, fragile, and easily disrupted under stress. In practical terms, this means that skills like impulse control, emotional regulation, and follow-through remain effortful and unreliable because the brain has not built efficient wiring to support them. This is why avoidance has such a powerful impact on development. If discomfort is regularly escaped rather than tolerated, the brain never gets the repeated activation it needs to strengthen those circuits. Without myelination, the prefrontal cortex struggles to consistently override emotional or impulsive responses, especially during moments of stress, fatigue, or pressure. Over time, this lack of efficient wiring contributes to stalled maturity, not because the brain is incapable of growth, but because the necessary practice has been missing. If regulation is consistently avoided, maturity does not progress as expected, and development can stall. In this way, development does not simply slow down, it diverts onto a different path. This diversion becomes especially pronounced when substances enter the picture. The prefrontal cortex depends on dopamine to remain engaged, and in ADHD, dopamine signaling is already inefficient. Substances artificially flood the system with dopamine or suppress discomfort so effectively that the brain no longer needs to generate its own regulatory signals. Over time, this reduces the brain's motivation to build internal control, blunts natural dopamine production, and lowers baseline motivation even further, reinforcing reliance on external regulation rather than internal skill development. So the very chemical system needed to mature the CEO is being outsourced. The CEO goes offline during a critical training window. During adolescence and young adulthood, the prefrontal cortex is meant to be actively learning how to pause before reacting, anticipate consequences, manage emotions under stress, and tolerate boredom and frustration. When substances such as THC, nicotine, or other drugs are introduced, they suppress or bypass this system, preventing the prefrontal cortex from fully engaging in this training process. As a result, the CEO of the brain is not practicing decision-making, while the amygdala continues to dominate emotional responses. Reactions remain fast and intense, and although insight may still be present, the capacity for control and follow-through is weakened. While peers are building regulation through everyday experiences, the substance-using ADHD brain is effectively skipping those repetitions, and development follows repetition, not age. This is why parents often describe what feels like regression, noticing that their child seemed to be doing better before, or now appears emotionally younger. What is typically occurring is developmental stalling, where the brain has stopped practicing regulation. Tolerance for discomfort has decreased, and executive stamina has diminished. Although this can feel alarming, it is not irreversible. The brain remains plastic, and development can resume when substances are reduced or removed. Regulation is practiced again. External scaffolding increases. shame is reduced, and structure replaces chaos. Time alone does not drive this process forward. Meaningful experience does. Nicotine is a neuroactive drug, not a harmless form of stimulation, and its effects on the developing brain are often underestimated. In a brain that is still maturing, nicotine artificially spikes dopamine, which the brain interprets as relief, improved focus, and a sense of calm. For individuals with ADHD, this effect can feel especially powerful at first, which is why many teens and young adults report that nicotine helps them concentrate or quiet their thoughts. From a neurological perspective, nicotine can feel like self-medication because it temporarily boosts the very neurotransmitters that are inconsistent in ADHD. This is what makes it so reinforcing and why its pull is not merely social, but deeply neurochemical. Over time, however, dopamine receptors downregulate in response to repeated artificial stimulation. Baseline motivation drops, focus worsens in the absence of nicotine, and anxiety and irritability increase. As a result, the brain is no longer learning how to regulate itself internally and instead becomes dependent on an external chemical regulator. Parents often observe a predictable cycle in which their teen appears calmer while using nicotine and more dysregulated when they are not, leaving the entire family caught in that loop. This pattern is not a character flaw or lack of willpower. It is the developing brain adapting to repeated external chemical regulation. THC interferes with the endocannabinoid system, a regulatory network that plays a critical role in brain maturation, neural communication, and emotional balance. This system helps guide synaptic pruning, the process by which the brain strengthens efficient pathways and trims away those that are less useful. When THC is introduced during development, it disrupts this pruning process, making neural wiring less efficient and less organized over time. THC also suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for judgment, impulse control, and decision-making, which limits the brain's ability to practice and strengthen executive functioning skills. In addition, THC impairs memory formation and consolidation by affecting hippocampal functioning, leading to gaps in learning and recall. Emotional regulation is weakened as well, as the brain relies more heavily on limbic reactivity rather than prefrontal modulation. Together, these effects interfere with the natural trajectory of brain development, particularly during adolescence and young adulthood, when these systems are still under construction. The HC can feel calming, but it does so by taking the CEO offline. It quiets distress by reducing the brain's ability to fully process and integrate experience in the moment. This matters because the prefrontal cortex needs lived experience to mature. Over time, parents often notice increasing apathy, poor follow-through, memory gaps, emotional volatility, and a significant reduction in motivation. Many describe it as a subtle but unsettling shift rather than a complete personality change. Their child can still be funny, socially engaged, and outwardly connected, yet the internal drive that once propelled them forward seems to disappear. Initiative collapses, persistence becomes difficult, and emotional tolerance drops sharply. These changes are not a reflection of laziness or lack of character. They are signs of neurological interference occurring during a critical period of brain development when executive functioning systems are still under construction. Vaping delivers higher concentrations, faster absorption, and more frequent dosing. That means stronger dopamine spikes, faster dependency, and less recovery time. This is important. If the brain gets repeated rapid hits of relief, the brain learns a powerful association. Discomfort equals vape. Stress equals vape. Boredom equals vape. Social awkwardness equals vape. For an ADHD brain that already struggles to tolerate boredom and discomfort, vaping creates a perfect storm. The relief is immediate. The learning is immediate. The dependency loop builds quickly. Parents often say they don't care anymore or they're not themselves. What is happening underneath is a lowered dopamine baseline, impaired executive functioning, and an underengaged prefrontal cortex. When effort feels overwhelming, tasks begin to feel pointless, time becomes distorted, and emotions swing between flatness and sudden intensity. It can be tempting to interpret these patterns as lack of care or motivation. In reality, these experiences are signs of a nervous system and prefrontal cortex that are under strain and still developing. This is not a moral failing or a character flaw. It is a developmental issue rooted in how the brain processes stress, motivation, and regulation, especially in the context of ADHD and ongoing neurodevelopment. And it is also why punishment often backfires. If the prefrontal cortex is underpowered, harsh consequences do not suddenly turn it on. They often spike cortisol, activate the amygdala, and lead to more avoidance, more lying, and more shutdown. This matters because adolescence and young adulthood are not just about behavior. They are about brain construction. Every difficult moment, waiting, coping, being bored, managing frustration, repairing mistakes, is a workout for the prefrontal cortex. When substances enter during this window, the brain is not just relaxing, it is missing opportunities to build capacity. And in ADHD, where development is already delayed, those missed opportunities matter more. This is why parents often feel like they are parenting the same argument on repeat. The skill has not wired yet. This is why consequences alone don't work. You cannot punish a brain into maturation. This is why structure, predictability, and calm adult regulation are not indulgent. They are developmental necessities. This is not about controlling children or managing behavior through force or fear. It is about protecting the developmental window in which growth is most possible. When the environment supports regulation, reduces unnecessary stress, and allows for repeated practice, the brain is given the opportunity to mature in the way it is meant to. Safeguarding this window means prioritizing conditions that support learning and resilience rather than short-term compliance, recognizing that long-term development depends on safety, consistency, and support. This is where I want to shift the conversation from what interferes with development to what actively supports it. Because exercise is not just good for kids. It is one of the most powerful, evidence-based tools we have for building the ADHD brain. And I want to be very clear about why. What aerobic exercise actually does to the brain? When we talk about aerobic exercise, we are talking about sustained movement that elevates heart rate. Walking briskly, running, swimming, biking, surfing, dancing, team sports. This type of movement changes the brain immediately and long term. During aerobic exercise, the brain increases availability of dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, endorphins, and it increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, also called BDNF. These are not feel-good buzzwords. These are the exact neurochemicals the ADHD brain struggles to regulate. Dopamine, the motivation and focus chemical. Dopamine is the fuel for the prefrontal cortex. Exercise increases dopamine production naturally without hijacking the system the way nicotine or substances do. This matters because dopamine supports focus, dopamine supports motivation, and dopamine keeps the CEO online. In ADHD, where dopamine clears too quickly, exercise provides a clean, sustainable boost that helps the brain practice regulation instead of bypassing it. Norepinephrine, attention and alertness. Norepinephrine helps the brain stay alert and engaged, and it improves the brain's ability to filter distractions. Aerobic exercise increases norepinephrine in a way that improves attention span, task engagement, and response inhibition. This is why many kids and adults with ADHD think more clearly after movement, not before. Serotonin, mood, and emotional stability. Serotonin helps regulate mood, anxiety, and emotional balance. Exercise increases serotonin availability, which reduces baseline anxiety, improves emotional resilience, and buffers against irritability and shutdown. This is not the numbing calm of substances. This is emotional steadiness. Endorphins, the regulated happy. Endorphins are the body's natural pain and stress modulators. They reduce physical and emotional pain, lower stress response, and create a sense of calm after effort. This is the important difference for parents. Exercise creates a regulated happy. It is not the spike and crash relief of substances. It is an earned calm that comes from the body learning, I can do hard things and survive it. BDNF, the brain's growth factor. BDNF is essentially fertilizer for the brain. It supports neuroplasticity, strengthens learning and memory, helps neurons grow and connect, and supports prefrontal cortex development. In other words, exercise literally helps the brain grow better wiring. If substances interrupt brain development by stopping practice, exercise does the opposite. It accelerates healthy development by strengthening the pathways we want online. What exercise does to the body and why that matters for the brain. The brain does not develop in isolation from the body. Aerobic exercise improves sleep quality, regulates blood sugar, reduces cortisol, improves insulin sensitivity, and increases oxygen delivery to the brain. For ADHD, this matters because poor sleep worsens executive dysfunction, blood sugar crashes mimic emotional dysregulation, and high cortisol keeps the amygdala overactive. Exercise helps stabilize the entire system, not just behavior. For ADHD, exercise is not optional enrichment. It is neurological support. Exercise helps the prefrontal cortex stay online longer. It improves emotional regulation, increases frustration tolerance, reduces impulsivity, improves sleep, and builds confidence in self-regulation. And most importantly, exercise gives the ADHD brain practice regulating without avoidance. That is the opposite of what substances teach. If substances delay development by muting discomfort and bypassing the brain's natural learning process, exercise supports development by teaching the brain how to move through discomfort safely and productively. Through repeated physical effort, the nervous system learns that discomfort is tolerable, temporary, and survivable, which builds distress tolerance rather than avoidance. Exercise strengthens executive stamina by requiring initiation, sustained effort, and follow through, while also improving emotional regulation through natural increases in dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins. Over time, this creates a sense of confidence rooted in capability rather than escape. This is why movement is so often a turning point for teens and young adults struggling with ADHD and substance use. It offers a different pathway to relief that builds capacity instead of undermining it. Executive functioning develops most effectively in environments that combine predictable routines, external structure, visual systems, body-based regulation, adequate sleep, consistent nutrition and hydration, regular movement, and safe relationships with calm, regulated adults. This approach is not permissive parenting. It is neurodevelopmentally informed parenting grounded in how the brain actually grows. If you want a brain to mature, it is essential to create an environment that reduces cortisol while increasing opportunities for practice, because chronic stress directly interferes with healthy brain development. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone, and while short bursts can be adaptive, prolonged elevation keeps the brain in a survival state. When cortisol remains high, the amygdala becomes more reactive and dominant, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, impulse control, and emotional regulation, goes offline. In this state, the brain is focused on protection, not learning. Skills such as frustration tolerance, problem solving, and self-control cannot develop effectively when the nervous system is constantly on alert. Reducing cortisol through predictability, calm adult regulation, consistent routines, and emotional safety allows the brain to shift out of survival mode and into a state where practice is possible. Once stress levels are lowered, the brain can tolerate discomfort, repeat skills, make mistakes, and integrate feedback. This repeated practice is what strengthens neural pathways and supports long-term maturation, making regulation and executive functioning more accessible over time. The practical translation for parents is this: begin by supporting the nervous system so the brain is not operating in survival mode, then create clear, predictable structure that reduces overwhelm and cognitive load, and finally provide repeated, low-drama opportunities for practice so the brain can gradually build the regulatory and executive skills it is designed to develop over time. Reducing unnecessary chaos in the environment creates a sense of predictability that allows the nervous system to settle and the thinking brain to stay online. When power struggles are minimized, interactions are less likely to trigger defensiveness and emotional reactivity, making it easier for learning and growth to occur. Clear, predictable structure helps the brain anticipate what comes next, reducing anxiety and cognitive overload. Routines that are simple, repeatable, and sustainable support consistency over time rather than relying on motivation or memory. Visual systems are used to offload information from working memory, allowing a developing brain to focus on execution instead of constant recall. Executive functioning is externalized through tools, cues, and systems rather than expected to be managed internally before it is fully developed. A regulated, steady tone helps keep the emotional climate calm, even during difficult moments, and firm, consistent boundaries are maintained without emotional escalation or shame, reinforcing safety while supporting long-term development. Calm and consistent parenting is not simply a technique or a set of behavioral tools. It is a form of brain architecture support. When parents respond with steadiness, predictability, and emotional regulation, they create the external conditions the developing brain needs in order to organize itself. Consistency reduces cortisol and keeps the amygdala from dominating, while calm responses allow the prefrontal cortex to stay engaged and practice decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Over time, these repeated experiences strengthen neural pathways associated with safety, self-control, and resilience. In this way, calm and consistent parenting does not just manage behavior in the moment. It actively shapes how the brain wires itself for long-term regulation, maturity, and adaptive functioning. This episode is for educational purposes and to provide support. It's not a substitute for professional mental health evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment. The more we learn to recognize the neurological and developmental signs behind behavior, the less likely we are to interpret reactions as defiance, laziness, or lack of care. When behavior is understood as communication from a developing nervous system rather than a character flaw, our responses naturally shift. Compassion replaces reactivity, curiosity replaces judgment, and support replaces power struggles. This understanding allows parents, partners, and caregivers to respond in ways that reduce shame and increase safety, which are the conditions the brain needs to grow and regulate. As insight deepens, not only do our children benefit from calmer, more attuned support, but we also extend that same compassion to our partners and to ourselves, recognizing that everyone is doing the best they can with the brain and tools they have in that moment. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this episode was helpful, I'd love it if you shared it with a fellow parent, caregiver, or educator who might need it too. You can also subscribe to stay up to date on future episodes and check out additional tools and resources at thepath2peacetherapy.com. Follow me on Instagram at thepath2peacetherapy. If you are in California, I offer virtual sessions if you are not in the Hermosa Beach and South Bay area. You can book online at the Path to Peace Therapy. And as always, take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, peace is possible, and you don't have to do this alone.